Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Rodrigo Viana, and I'm the head of the International Office, the International Affairs Office at FGV Direito Rio. It's a pleasure to have you here again for this third week of the second FGV Chicago Forum in Law and Economics in Brazil. Today we have a special guest, a friend of us, Professor Luciano Tim from FGV Direito São Paulo, who will be properly introduced by colleague Maria Lúcia from Direito São Paulo as well. I would like to say, first of all, that all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on at FGV's and Chicago University official channels. I would like to send as well my acknowledgements to Professor Omri Ben-Shahar for this partnership together with the School of Law of Chicago University. Well, just a quick reminder that it's possible for you to send your questions to our lecturer today, Professor Luciano, through the chat that we have at the YouTube. In any case, if you are not seeing the chat, please refresh your webpage, then you'll be possible to integrate and have the discussions with Professor Luciano. So with no more delays, I would like to give words to my colleague, Maria Lúcia. And once again, thank you, Luciano, very much. It's an honor to have you here once again in another forum in law and economics in this joint initiative. Thank you very much for being here. Maria Lúcia, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Rodrigo. This week, we are discussing the law and the pandemic and economic analysis. Last Tuesday, we had the opportunity to attend a lecture by Professor Daniel Hamel from the Chicago University. Today, we'll have a lecture by Professor Luciano Tim, our dear colleague from the FGV Direito São Paulo. Luciano is a professor of law and economics at FGV Direito São Paulo, and also he's a well-known lawyer in arbitration and economic regulation market. Professor Tim has a master and doctor in law from the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul and the LLM from the University of Warwick. He has a postdoctoral research at the Berkeley University. Professor Luciano Tim was the founder and president of the Brazilian Association of Law and Economics in Brazil. Professor Tim is a former National Consumer Secretary at the Ministry of Justice and current a member of the National Consumer Protection Council at the Ministry of Justice. And I would like to add that my dear colleague Luciano has participated since the beginning of our negotiations for the conclusion of the agreement to create the University of Chicago FGV Forum on Law and Economics in Brazil. Thank you so much, Professor Luciano, my dear colleague. You have the digital floor.
Hello, good afternoon, Rodrigo, Maria Lúcia, and our friends and colleagues from Chicago and also from FGV. I'm truly honored to be here. It has a personal touch for me. As Maria Lúcia just mentioned, I was one of the founders of the Association of Law and Economics. I studied these fields during my undergraduate courses. So for me to see they coming together is, and having both mother and father economists and being a lawyer, it's kind of really a dream coming real. And teaching at FGV probably is even I could maybe not imagine being educated in a public school in Brazil to be here and part of this joint program with the School of Law and Economics, where Law and Economics was founded, and I was there 4 years ago at Ronald Coase Institute. And how could one not be happier than being at Ronald Coase Institute of Law and Economics in Chicago, and then in this joint program with our colleagues from there. So I really miss all the professors that 2 years ago came here, actually to Rio, for the last physical event of the association, Professor Shahar, Professor Henderson, and so I'm really honored to be here. So my idea today is to bring some reflections of law and economics during the pandemics. It started from the end, but okay, just sort it out. I will present some ideas from the pragmatic world, I would say, but then I would be happy to have some questions and discussions at the end of the presentation. So my idea here would be to examine some effects of the pandemic on contracts, especially using the lens of the traditional law and economics thinking. And if possible, I will add some insights from behavioral law and economics, if I have the time to discuss some consumer agreements. But by and large, I will be focusing on commercial agreements here today. And I like this quote from Renato Meirelles from Instituto Locomotiva. It's an important institute of consumer behavior. He said last year that we lived 5 years in 5 months. To give a real idea, and it's not only a metaphor in a way, of the dramatic changes we saw in terms of behavioral changes. Everything is online, even this event, but our teaching, arbitration hearings, court hearings, medical appointments, government is working largely remotely, restaurants. So we have this huge behavioral change, but we could also see dramatic impacts on contract law. Some sectors suffer more, such as aviation and tourism, as is well known, but I am interested in contractual discussions here. And some sectors, there might have some gains, such as e-commerce, delivery, and agribusiness. The pandemic is and has been a great social lab for regulatory discussions as well as contract economic balance. I will bring discussions here on future or forward agreements related to soybean purchase, airport and port concessions, leasing, and if possible, and if I have the time, it's not the main topic as I mentioned earlier, consumer relations, and maybe IP agreements. And after all, I would say that my goal here is to discuss really what is, and it has been discussed in courts recently, what is a commercial contractual relationship? And I would like to add an expression made by a friend economist saying that contract law is suffering now in courts. An engineer term, we could say material resistance testing, to say that we are testing our contract law to the limit. And I would like to propose how law and economics could help to solve those cases. So because I'm focusing on a more pragmatic approach, I would use the more general theory of law and economics and contract law. And this is interesting for us because unlike US contract law, the Brazilian contract law has very broad principles within our civil code, such as social function of contract law. This is one article. Another article is good faith. And we also have an article about the economic and financial balance of agreements. So it's self-evident that this black letter of the law gives plenty of room for court intervention. That was even before the pandemic, but during the pandemic itself, one can imagine the extent of this room for court intervention. And I'm going to select what I see from my experience and looking at the cases, the most interesting set of cases, and select them, and through a scenic flight, I would say a panoramic view of those cases, trying to build a case inventory so that we can look at how courts will solve those problems that are going on right now, and suggesting how law and economics could help the courts, and then we can, in the near future, not so near because our courts are not as fast as the US courts, but we could see if the law and economics arguments helped the discussion. And I would suggest that we have room also for law and economics to be considered by courts, because, as I mentioned, we have such broad principles that law and economics could be used, and has been used actually in some cases to solve the problem. So the first case I have, I think it's one of the most interesting cases, set of cases. It's what I'm calling the anticipated soybean sale cases, or the forward agreements. Those are discussions between farmers who sell the grain, the soy, in advance at a certain price, and then they seek in court, and they have been seeking in court, rebalance of the installments due to the increase in international quotation of the soy price, allegedly due to the COVID. So the idea is that the farmers sell in advance for a certain price in certain amount of products, and now they want to give less products than already sold because of the variation of prices, saying that the price went up and it was not expected beforehand, and the increase in price was due to COVID. And this was covered by the media. Valor Econômico, one of our most important newspapers in economics, brought even the headline, "Imbroglio over soy contracts in court. High prices not expected in anticipated sales generate turmoil between producers and trading companies." And then this headline is addressed by those discussions that I'm referring here. And I would like to propose some questions about how law and economics could help to solve those cases. And we know from law and economics, so everybody is well aware of, that is a theory based on idea that agreements are entered into by two parties with some limited, but with rationality, and balancing the trade-offs, considering the information, and then expecting some results. So if we bear that in mind, we can ask, in those kind of agreements, who are the parties? And we will find some small farmers, but we would see, especially in the industry of soy, of the production of the soy bean, big producers. It's more common that small farmers will be producing fruits and tobacco, but it's not common that they produce, especially in the Midwest Brazil, which is the most important area nowadays in production of soy. They are big companies. So we're not talking about a small party confronting a huge company. The traders are mostly multinational companies, some of them nowadays controlled by Chinese companies, and they have been very active in Brazilian agribusiness markets. So they are, generally speaking, sophisticated parties entering into a commercial agreement. What is the economic rationale of these agreements? Normally, it's a form of hedging the price so that the farmer would know, considering his cost, he or her cost, a certain price to cover the cost and offer some level of profit. And also, it's a way to hedge and avoid risks of high losses, because one can imagine that if the price in the future is below the costs of production, then farmers would suffer losses. And we could also see it in some cases that these agreements serve also as a way to finance the crop, so that the farmers get the money, get the funding from the traders. So it's a way to avoid banking finance or finance coming through the bank, which tend to be more expensive, because in Brazil, it's the banking market is a relatively concentrated industry when compared to the US market. We could also, we can also think about what would be the consequences if courts start, or if the court intervene in those freely entered agreements. And we have enough evidence that it would probably create a risk for disrupting the market. And I have some evidence that I brought here. Brazil experienced these discussions in courts revising soy agreements in more than 10 years ago. The experience was not good because the court does not understand this market, does not understand the economic rationale, and the intervention we had was not good for the market as a whole. So as I say to my students, we must think in economic terms. That would mean to see the problem as the legal problem as the forest and not as the tree that is under discussion in court. So we must think in terms of statistics and expected consequences of the court decision. And we could also have the help of law and economics to understand if the increase in price was caused by COVID. Apparently, this is not the case. Actually, Brazil last year had an increase in our agricultural GDP. So it was not, generally speaking, and in theory, a sector that suffers too much that need court intervention. And this is if someone wants to go through the data and or a more general explanation. So the first one is more general article, newspaper article, and the second one is a more academic work with evidence. The second set of cases are cases dealing with, those are real cases that I could look at because it's public records of the case, so I could look at them. And our cases not solved yet, but I could see the arguments and the discussion. Cases related to lease of parking area at airports. And here the discussions are related to revision of fixed rental installments due to the loss of revenue caused by the reduced number of flights and passengers. The idea of those agreements is that we have been privatizing these airports and concessions and even the space for parking lots at airports. Several airport parking spaces lease were executed before COVID, so the parties could not foresee the pandemic and its effects. The purpose of the agreement was to offer parking spaces to airport users in the country. And normally those agreements would involve a fixed price to be paid by the tenant who would explore this area, and the revenue of the enterprise would come from the demand of passengers when boarding and disembarking using the airport, when they, of course, use their cars. And the reality is that the demand for air transportation services during COVID really decreased to an unprecedented levels. It's really much higher than the impact of, for instance, in this industry on the impact of 9/11, 20 years ago. So it was really unprecedented, the levels of the decrease. So here I could check in terms of numbers. We could see that in the orange was 2020 and the blue 2019, and the gray is 2021, in which we had the second, we have been having actually the second wave of COVID. But what I want to call your attention that, and in Brazil, January, February tend to be high season because it's summer. But we haven't seen a decrease because COVID really started, let's say, begin to start in March, but then we can see the effects already in March, a decrease, a huge increase in April, an absurd decrease in May, and started to go up, but far away from the previous year, and then again 2021, another decrease in revenues, passenger, etc. If we look at the revenue decrease, we are talking in Brazilian money, Brazilian currency. We're talking about here just three airports as an example. The Curitiba, it's an important city of the south. Goiânia, it's an important city of Midwest. And São Luís, it's an important city of Northeast, just to have different locations. But the impact was minus 92 in the south, minus 93 in Midwest, and minus 21 in amount of people and decrease in revenues. And the situation was so difficult that the revenue of the company was less than the fixed price to be paid. So it was impossible to keep with the business. And again, how law and economics could help if we take into account the lessons of law and economics of contract law, bringing them to Brazilian reality, as I have been doing for the latest 15 years. Could we think about a drop in revenues foreseen by the parties, differently from a variation of prices of the soy in international market? Brazil had already seen that in the past. That drop in air transportation, we have never seen that before, such a decrease. And if we take into account the theory of asymmetric information and the idea of the incompleteness of agreements, assuming that according to law and economics theory, no contract law is fully complete. It deserves a completion by courts or arbitrators. And the asymmetric information, I mean, no one could have data to foresee such dramatic impact. We could, with law and economics, we could use also some consequential arguments. What would be the consequence of a court intervention? Those companies have risks of bankruptcy. And we could also bring arguments related to if the drop of revenues was caused by COVID. I mean, really it was, if we control the variables here. So this is a third set of cases, and some lawyers ask me, or judges, how would I use them? So we would need to use them through the lawyers in the cases, and the lawyers using probably experts, economic experts. So it would be a way to use law and economics in practice, in courts litigation. And as I said, I think there's huge possibility, and those cases are actually using already law and economics. A third case is related to Brazil has this technology of building inflation indexes, because we used to have in the past a huge inflation. And actually, Getúlio Vargas is responsible for calculating those indexes. And one of them is called IGPM. It's a tool, it's an index that uses another indexes to calculate inflation. And it's a common practice that I've never seen in the US to use this inflation index in agreements, so that the agreement would suffer this variation each year. And surprisingly, last year, IGPM was 23% up. So one can imagine have its rental adjusted 23% in 1 year. I don't think no one got a salary increase in that amount. And here, how law and economics could help? Well, we could explain to the judge the difference between IGPM, with the help of economists, of course, but how IGPM is calculated and how the indexes used to calculate that index. And there's a specific index to measure the variation of inflation of the rental prices. So we're talking about 23% IGPM versus 3% IGPM rental. The problem is that the parties specifically chosen IGPM, not IGP rental. So how the court would address a case in which the tenant wants a revision of the agreement so that to use a different index that was chosen by the parties. This is not impossible. As I mentioned, we have legal basis for that. The thing is in discussion here if that would be a good path. And one of the reflections that I would like to make is, do the landlords have economic power over tenants during a pandemic? We have plenty of data regarding, especially in commercial leases, that people are staying at home. So a lot of companies are returning the real estate and not using it as before. A lot of people staying at home. So a lot of offer during the pandemic. So do the courts need to intervene in this market, or the parties could choose or could negotiate without the court intervention, and then we could think about Coase theorem. Why should the state judge intervene in something that parties or the market could solve as a whole? And we could also bear in mind what happened in countries that pass laws forbidding rental prices adjustments during pandemics. There's the famous case of Berlin. It seems that ended up increasing the prices of the rental because landlords were not putting their real estate for rental. So there was a decrease in the offer side of the market. So interesting case as well. So maybe the story here should be that the parties could solve the problem without the need of court intervention, and but there's economic and legal basis for those discussions in courts, and courts are addressing this issue lately. A fourth set of cases are related to consumer agreements. I think it's most interesting to discuss prices and masks and hand sanitizers. Here we are, there are several cases. I want to address the price rise during the pandemic, especially with masks and hand sanitizers. Our consumer code prohibits unfair price increase, kind of price gouging, not exactly, but our law says unfair price increase. We have a lot of consumer protection agencies, municipal and state agencies, what we call Procons. Some of them decided to limit the profit in order to avoid unfair price increase. Some state legislators passed laws prohibiting price increase during the pandemic, which is astonishing, but some countries also did that. And then how law and economics could help here? I think it's a way to try to use regulatory impact analysis, thinking about cost-benefit analysis in terms of intervention, price caps. Can consumer agencies regulate prices? Economists tend to be very concerned when agencies try to fix a price or even a price cap. Sometimes price cap tend to be anti-competitive. I think it's also an opportunity to think how consumer law is connected to competition. In the US, this is, clear because even the agency, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, deals with consumer protection as well as antitrust. We have different bodies. So we have our antitrust agency, CADE, and we have 900 Procons, state and municipal consumer protection agencies, plus the federal one at the DOJ, the Brazilian Ministry of Justice. But at the end, they both deal with economic law. So one is the side of demand and the other one is the side of the offer, and we should see them combined. And what are the consequences of an intervention on prices? Maybe it would be the lack of products such as masks, such as hand sanitizers. Dealing with this unfair price increase, there was a technical note from Senacom that was issued with the Ministry of Economics in 2020. The conclusion was it's only an orientation. It's not binding for the state and the municipal level. But the idea was to avoid price control and price caps. The idea was to understand if there was an opportunistic behavior from the offer side of the market, if companies were having a unfair behavior in the pandemic, trying to raise prices without any economic rationale. And to assess that, one must understand what happens, what are happening in the market. So at that time, Senacom notified mask sellers. A lot of them in Brazil. Brazil at that time was not self-sufficient in mask production. Brazil depended on China, as many other countries. And importers were paying $5 for a pack of masks before pandemics, and 100 reais or dollars after the pandemic. But this increase in price was not the result of an opportunistic behavior, at least apparently. It was the result of supply and demand shocks, because China was the first country to impose restrictions, lockdowns, and lockdowns of the Chinese are very restrict and with a lot of government control, more at least than in Brazil. It's another subject. I'm not interested right now. I'm just discussing agreements, but the fact that the suppliers in China are really closed down and are not offering the market, the masks in the market, of course, amounts into a supply shock. But also, before the pandemic, only doctors and nurses and healthcare people were using masks. But after pandemic, judges, lawyers, scholars, teachers are using also. So there was a demand shock as well. So the price increase was the result of this demand and supply problem, and fixing a price cap probably would not be a good idea. We don't have many examples that some countries try to put a price cap. Price caps sometimes tend to create a competition problem and sometimes even open the door for cartels. But again, I want to focus on the agreements, and the case here is the agreement of purchasing masks and also hand sanitizer. So Brazil decided by this technical note not intervening in the price, and we are not seeing anymore this situation of alleged unfair price increase. It ended up the market solving the problem. We heard that Argentina fixed the price, and a lot of goods are lacking for consumers. All the experience in Brazil trying to fixing prices, we all remember the Sarney times. I don't think we should be envisaging having this experience again. There are some discussion. We had some discussion about the increase in rice, because a lot of agreements were entering into again, but there was no intervention in the price of rice as well. And finally, because I still have a remaining time, so another set of very interesting discussions of cases and are related to IP licenses. COVID once again brought about a discussion on the social function of property. We have this in our constitution. As I mentioned, we have a provision of social function of contract, but we also have in our constitution and in our civil code a provision on social function of property and, by extension, of intellectual property. And our Supreme Court used this argument of COVID to reject an old single paragraph from the Article 40 of our patent law that was passed to be according to the TRIPS agreement, the traded related aspect of intellectual property. So the TRIPS, it's from 1996 or 97, and this law is from 1997. So 30 years after this passing of this law, our Supreme Court rejected as unconstitutional a paragraph that it's a technicality, legal technicality that I don't want to focusing on right now, but our Supreme Court ended up using a constitutional argument to restrict the validity of the period of the patent. We still have 20 years, but there is no mechanism anymore to extend the patent that was a result of inefficiency of our patent office. So there was a restriction already in the patent period. But I think more interesting in terms of agreements is the Parliament discussion on making COVID-19 vaccine patents more flexible and allowing compulsory license from those vaccines. Differently from other BRICS, Brazil was not capable of generating a patent on COVID vaccine. Russia did, even though the Russian vaccine was not approved by our health agency so far. India was capable. China has more than one patent related to vaccines. Brazil was not capable. I think it's something that we need to think about. But the solution of our lack of innovation is a discussion of licensing. And so what has been discussed is this patent license. The government of the United States signalized that the US government would be happy to discuss, so very smart in terms of politics, to have a discussion of that in the body responsible for international commerce, WTO. But here we're discussing really a federal law for compulsory licensing. Experts say that this wouldn't solve the problem because companies would need to be taught in how to produce those vaccines, and especially having the technology to produce them and all the means to produce the vaccine. But and recently, and maybe advancing the discussion, AstraZeneca decided to produce the vaccine in Brazil and licensing all the means to do that. But how an economics could help, I think I'm more interested in that here. And then we have all the law and economics theory of IP laws as the incentives for innovation, and the idea of sweat of the brow. Some people argue that 20 years is that our patent duration is one size fits all, that is not serving for too much, because 20 years could be too much in some industries. Some people say that in other industries is too low. I think we can have this discussion, but I don't think the Supreme Court is the right place have this discussion because we need numbers. We have field research on that. We can have discussions about if big farms are charging too much. I don't have all the data, but apparently some of them are selling the vaccines without a margin, profit margin. But it's something to look at and to have discussions. Is patent licensing a need, or is it enough? Apparently not, and it's more apparently a political thing rather than solving pragmatically the problem of innovation. And everybody knows, or some people are claiming that this pandemic is one, and we will have others. And this is something we wrote, an economist and I, about these discussions. And this is the end for the presentation, but I would be happy to take questions and having discussions with all of you. Thank you, Rodrigo and Maria Lucia, for the invitation. And yes, I'm here for the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luciano, for the brilliant presentation. So interesting, showing the cases, so you can materialize a little bit the problems that we face with COVID and how law and economics can help in that sense. Well, we have a question here from Leonardo Gioacchini. Thank you, Leonardo, for your question. And he asks, Professor, regarding the IP case and the inconstitutionality of the sole paragraph of Article 40 of the LPI, what could have been, in your opinion, a more moderate approach from the Supreme Court in terms of balancing best the right to health in one hand and on the other, the rights of inventors and incentives to innovation?
Well, Leonardo, thank you for your question. I think the best approach, the law and economics approach to this case came actually from two justices from Rio, from the city of Rodrigo. Justices Fuchs and Justice Fuchs and Justice Barroso. They both, especially Justice Fuchs, has a book on law and economics of procedural law. So I think we now in Brazil reach a position that United States didn't. Posner did not reach the Supreme Court. Sorry. But they both, Barroso, Justice Barroso less, but he uses, and we have cases in which I supervise a master thesis on that. And we have already empirical documentation that we have cases using law and economics in our Supreme Court. And they both argued that the best approach was to, for the court to allow the parliament to have a discussion on IP laws using more data, that the court should avoid to intervene 30 years of the passing, after the passing of the law. And I wrote an article and I wrote a legal opinion, I have to be honest, in this case, that of course the vaccines are something that we should be very sensible. Some people think that libertarians don't care for others. I think this is a very flawed critics, because libertarians like Adam Smith, and Adam Smith always mentioned the importance of empathy. And so we must be quite aware about this strategy and the human tragedy of vaccines, of COVID. But there are many other industries that need patents. We can think about, in terms of Brazilian strategy, we can think about Embrapa, for instance. It's a public company that developed patents in agribusiness markets, it was affected. Petrobras, our giant oil company, produced a lot of patents in energy market. It was affected. And the court ended up doing a kind of, I think it was kind of a political decision, because there's no legal basis to treat differently. The sole paragraph is unconstitutional for vaccines, and it's not constitutional for other technologies. I mean, this is something, with all due respect to our Supreme Court, but academically speaking, I don't see a legal basis for that. And I think economics could help a lot, empirical work, and I think the parliament could do that. I mean, vaccines that are supplied by, because Brazil has something that US does not have, the US does not have, it's a public health system, healthcare system, and our healthcare system provides for free some drugs. It's the case of the vaccine and other treatments, but so we must bear this in mind. There's an industry of litigation of drugs in Brazil, and Brazilian taxpayer, to some extent, taxpayers are subsidizing this industry and the other consumers in other countries, paying a lot for drugs here. But there are other industries, and I think the parliament would have the means to assess all of that, having all of that into consideration, and in a democratic and open debate, have a more detailed law, rather than having, this kind of, this judgment was also suspended, but the court decided to move this judgment forward urgently as a result of the pandemic. But we have empirical work saying that this sole paragraph was not affecting the COVID vaccine supply. So, I think it was more, in my view, with all due respect, more political than legal, and mostly law and economics decision. And if one is interested, if Leonardo is interested, you should have a look at the opinion of Justice Barroso.
Thank you, Luciano. Well, I am an enthusiast of ADR, alternative dispute resolution methods, and you've mentioned a lot of cases that end up in the courts, and all the litigation that was caused sometimes because of the COVID consequences. But I also kind of watched a movement, especially, for example, in the urban leasing contracts, of a lot of negotiations between the parties involved, in some consumer contracts, or suppliers and producers, a lot of negotiation, and maybe a kind of increase of arbitration as a good forum for deciding things, a part of the judiciary that sometimes, well, we have all the economic rationality behind ADR, the ADR movement and the ADR methods. Do you think it was an opportunity of increasing the idea of using ADR, the COVID helped in that movement as well?
Thank you for the question, Rodrigo. I, like yourself, I just love arbitration and mediation, more and more mediation, by the way. And I wrote some pieces dealing with the law and economics of arbitration, saying that at the end of the day, criticizing the view that arbitration is too expensive. And I wrote an article saying, is arbitration really too expensive? Because at the end of the day, court litigation is the most expensive. It's just that we don't see as taxpayers, because the litigation is highly subsidized in Brazil. It costs a lot, but we don't see because but 7% of our tax revenues goes to the judiciary. And I'm not criticizing, judges and such, but it's very expensive. So we shouldn't be using this very expensive system to solve problems that, again, Cole's theorem, that we could solve more efficiently with if the property rights is guarantee and transaction cost is not impossible to manage. Two parties negotiating, it's not something that we could call huge transaction cost. It's differently from setting the rules of torts. We could not put before driving 15 million people in a room discussing the tort rules, but two parties could negotiate. So I agree with you that I think the pandemic brought again rethinking if arbitration is expensive, because some people were saying that, well, we had this experience of arbitration, it didn't work the way we expected because it's litigation, lawyers, etc. But then the COVID brought, and the courts intervening in some of those cases, the court issued preliminary injunctions. So I was saying that the courts have not solved the cases yet in terms of merits, but there are injunctions, preliminary injunctions. It's a sort of intervention that already make people to believe that they should rethink arbitration. And one example that I am more pragmatic in the sense that I like more law and economics to help to solve real problems rather than, very speculative problems. And I was involved with clients saying, and associates saying, well, remember that I mentioned that Brazil already had in 2005 a discussion about soy variation. And the result was not good. And at that time, in 2008, I said, look, maybe we should put arbitration agreement so that, because courts tend to be, especially in some states, more paternalistic and protect the farmer, the poor farmer with who produce a lot of soy, and actually it's a businessman or woman. But a very paternalistic and lacking some economic training. And at that time I said that, and some people now are saying, look, Luciano, I think you're right. I think we should have put arbitration, and now we are, and even if the courts do not end up intervening in the merits, the discussion itself creates legal uncertainty, increase transaction costs, bring about uncertainties, create, that's what the evidence we have. Every time courts do not apply the agreement, economic agents start to feel, unsafe, high transaction costs, etc. So more than maybe we have been having arbitrations, but I think people are rethinking again if arbitration is a good deal, and especially mediation, this combined agreement, med arbitration, not med as crazy arbitration, but mediation arbitration clauses.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm also an enthusiast of mediation more than arbitration, especially when you have possibilities of solving quickly, confidentially, well, all the benefits that we already know about the ADR methods. Well, we have another question from Ematov. And Professor Luciano, congrats for the excellent lecture. In the IP case, how law and economics would approach the problem of transferring the social costs of the red tape inefficiency related to IP protection? INPI backlog. What kind of incentives were created with the Supreme Court decision? Thank you, Eduardo.
Great questions. I have a paper on that if people are interested on this, the law and economics of IP laws in Brazil. And what I suggested at that time, the paper is old, but I haven't changed my mind because it's a more generic paper in terms of general theory. If our patent office is inefficient, the incentive is not to create a good environment for innovation, right? I mean, what I saw in practice really is because the average of a patent registration in Brazil is more than 7 years. And in the US is 1.5 and Korea is 1.5 year. So the incentive is actually to register the patent in the US and then transact this right in Brazil, because what we know from law and economics is that when you have the property ownership, it values more than if you don't have. The idea of De Soto, right? The miracle of capital. If you have the property rights, your right values, and it's with legal certainty, your rights value more. So one thing is to have an expectation that you register before the patent office that I might have this patent, but the office will declare that after 7 years. But as Professor Kutter explained in the book, The Solomon Knot on law and development, to have innovation, you have to have someone inventing something and someone financing this invention. And if someone had an idea, put before the patent office, but the patent office take too long, when you go to the market for financing, the financer would say, let us wait to see what happens. Or you have this expectation, I pay you this for the shares of the companies. So the company, because sometimes that's how the finance works, right? The financer, the funder might acquire shares of the company, but then the poor entrepreneur needs to register them in the US, so when it sells the business here, the shares say, well, no, I have this registered at the patent office. So if one have a registration, the more efficient the patent office is, the better for the business. The Supreme Court assumed something that is economically speaking does not make any sense, as if some companies were having incentives to delay the concession of the patent. It does not make any sense because it's only devaluating my right, my patent right. What I want as the owner, I just want the patent office to give me the right as soon as possible. So this backlog is a problem, and the Supreme Court, rather, that's something we have culturally in Brazil, rather than solving the problem with efficiency, you create another problem to say that you try to solve it. It's quite well documented in the sociology classics, like Sérgio Buarque de Holanda. So rather than solving pragmatically, the Supreme Court said, well, there is this problem, so rather than making ENP more efficient, I just flexibilize IP laws. So I disagree with that approach, of course.
Thank you, Professor. Well, I think we have time for our last question from Eduardo Parente, also related to ADR. Professor, do you think that Brazil's alternative methods to dispute resolution regarding consumers' law are effective, such as consumer service, SACS, or the government's platform for these issues? Or we still have a culture of dispute?
Well, Brazil has the best ODR platform of the world, according to United Nations. which is the platform of consumidor.gov.br. Even FTC was interested in understanding at least this approach, this platform. From what I know, the US does not have such a platform, and it's a negotiation platform administered by the Ministry of Justice. It's a platform in which consumers would make their claim and the companies would respond, and the consumers evaluate if the claim was solved or not. So it's an empowerment of consumers. Last year, we had more than 1 million cases solved by this platform, through this platform, with 80% of efficiency. And in with the average of 6 days. So that's why United Nations says it's the best, because we have so many cases in Brazil. We have the proper environment to solve this problem, through a ODR, online dispute resolution mechanism. And one can imagine that during the pandemic, having something online, it's great because consumers wouldn't need to go to a physical place, exposing themselves to the pandemic. They could solve from the palm of their hands, So we have that. What we don't have, and we are on the verge to have, is a more efficient client service system through which companies would solve the problem of consumers by themselves. I think it's kind of a lack of competition. We're improving the competition, and companies are understanding that they must solve the consumer problem so that they don't lose the client. So the more competition we have, the higher the incentive to have more efficient internal systems. And there will be, it seems, apparently, because we have this discussion at the Council of Consumer Protection. It's an important council. We have their agencies, we have there the Ministry of Economics, we have there the Ministry of Justice, we have the NGOs, we have companies. So with a very broad discussion, we ended up having a draft of a decree that would make the system of companies more efficient, focusing on, like the consumidor.gov.br, in solving the problem, really. The set of incentives in the present decree is that companies might take the call of consumers in 1 minute, but it does not mean that by taking the call, the problem would be solved. And what we want is, it doesn't matter if it takes 1 minute or 2. What does matter is to solve the problem. And there is a professor from Yale called Shang. He wrote a piece on the companies as courthouses. So in the future, companies will need to have their own dispute resolution mechanism, as eBay has already one that solved 6 million disputes last year. And in Brazil, we have, it's not merchandise, but just because it's an experience, we have Mercado Livre, inspired by eBay, with its own platform to solve dispute between buyers and sellers. And it has been a huge success according to what they bring. And the numbers are 98% of what we would say judicialization, because it means a dispute that does not go to court. It is solved internally by the company itself. I think that's the tendency, but I think we would need to have still some paths in our consumidor.gov.br, not only negotiation, because remember, we still have 20% of people who are not solving their problem. So we need to address those 20%. And I think it's going to be by mediation. And why not? Why not arbitration? Some people are criticizing me because I'm talking about arbitration in consumer protection. But why not? If we assume that companies should solve the problem and pay for the problem they are causing to consumers, arbitration could be a way out of the problem. And we could have these arbitrations publicly available. We could have these arbitrations financed by the Ministry of Justice. It's going to be cheaper than the judiciary. Judiciary is very expensive system to solve small claims disputes.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Luciano. Thank you very much. Well,
By the way, Rodrigo, if you allow me, we have a center of dispute resolution at FGV.
Yes,
with mediation, with arbitration. I think some people from Rio told me an experience of helping the courts with the platform. When I was at the government, I was visited by one technology professor of FGV, and I was impressed by the system. The only problem is that we didn't move forward because we still have a lot of lack of understanding, mutual understanding between public and private sector. The private sector thinks that by and large people in the public servants don't work, and people in the public servants think that people in the market just look after profits. But I think we could improve that. And the vaccine, Oxford AstraZeneca, is a sign that if we don't put together companies and the university, we don't move forward. And I think this is something that in FGV, because we are a private organization, even if it's not profit oriented, I think we have this in our blood, but it's important that public entities understand that, and private entities, and we combine them in order to solve our problems.
Yeah, that's it. We do have, FGV does have a chamber of mediation, conciliation, and arbitration. And we are also really proud to teach law and economics to our undergraduate and graduate students. We have programs on that. And even more, we have programs on teaching law and economics to the judiciary. So I think this fulfills the FGV's mission to contribute to Brazilian development, all the social and economic development of the country. So I would thank you very much again, Luciano, for all your thoughts and your time here with us. Once again, it was a pleasure to hear and to learn from you. And we'll give word to Maria Lucia and then to you to your final words. Thanks a lot for this time with us.
Thank you.
Oh, just to say many thanks, Professor Luciano, for this valuable lecture. I do hope you have enjoyed this great opportunity, and I would like to invite you all to join us again on September 21st, next Tuesday, at the same time, 3 p.m. Chicago time or 5 p.m. São Paulo time, São Paulo real time. Once again, Luciano, thanks so much. Thank you all. Please.
Thank you, Maria Lucia. Thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you for our FGV and Chicago students and colleagues. It was really a pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward next year, if you know, God allow us, or you know, the forces of universe, for those who does not believe, or those who do not believe in God, but in the force of the universe, as the Greeks would say, the nature of laws, we could be even in São Paulo physically, or in Rio, or in Chicago.
Both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.